It's possible for two people to look at the same scene and see entirely different things. Several years ago, I spent 2 years working with the Evangelical Lutheran Church in Jordan and the Holy Land, specifically working with the schools that were run by that church in the West Bank. All of these schools were within a short drive's distance of Jerusalem, but because of the restrictions placed on movement of Palestinians living under occupation, it was not at all easy for them to travel to the city. And many of these students had never actually been to Jerusalem before. It was just down the road, but it was also on the other side of concrete roadblocks and a 6-meter-high wall. So it seemed, and was, an awfully long way off. And one spring when I was working there, we found an opportunity to organize a school visit to Jerusalem for a day, this day of sightseeing in the big city. We applied for the necessary permits we needed, and we loaded the kids on the buses, and we passed through the checkpoints. And when the kids got off the bus, there they were, in the old city of Jerusalem. These were middle schoolers, and they were being let out of what often felt like the cage of the communities that they lived in for a day in this city that was big in the history of their people and in their imagination. So you can imagine they were a little bit excited. That would actually be an understatement. They were practically bouncing off the walls. And about 30 minutes, a half hour into the day's tour, one of the teachers who had come along to help supervise the kids came up to me. And while I can't remember exactly what he said, it was pretty close to this. "Oh, Andy, this is a disaster. The kids are going crazy. Just look at them. How are we going to get them under control? They're running around. They're not listening to the tour guide. They're going crazy. I'm going crazy. How are we going to get through this day? Should we just take them back to Bethlehem now?" And I did my best to calm him down and assure him we would try to calm the kids down. And about 3 minutes later, unbidden, the other teacher, who was a chaperone, came up to me, and while I can't remember exactly what she said, it was something like this. "Oh, Andy, isn't this great? The kids are having such a good time. This is exactly what they needed. I'm so glad we brought them to Jerusalem." It is very possible for two people to look at the same scene and see something entirely different. That's what happened on that spring day in Jerusalem, and it's what happens today when people look at this reading we just heard from the Gospel of Mark. There's a single story here, but people see it in radically different ways. You just heard the story, and it's simple enough. Jesus and his disciples are in the temple in Jerusalem, and after a spat of heated exchanges with religious leaders there, Jesus takes a seat opposite the treasury, the place where people brought their offerings of money. And what do they see there? They see lots of wealthy people making large contributions and making sort of a scene of that, and one poor widow making a tiny contribution, 2 copper coins of the smallest denomination in circulation at the time. Jesus points out this contrast and points out that while hers was the smaller amount, the widow had actually made the larger contribution because she put in everything that she had to live on. And the first way to see this story, the way that we're probably most familiar with, is to see this unnamed woman as a model of generosity. Sure, goes this reading, she doesn't have much to give, but she gives everything that she has. Isn't that what Jesus asked the young man to do just a few chapters ago? The one who we learned had many possessions, and in response to Jesus' invitation, went away grieving? It sure looks like this woman did precisely what that young man couldn't do. So, goes this reading, she is the model. She sets the high bar to show us what generosity really looks like. And isn't it convenient that we have a story like that on the day when we are asking all of you to bring your contributions for the coming year? It all works out pretty well, right? That's one way of seeing the scene here in the temple treasury, as a fairly isolated event that makes sense when you read it on its own. But if you read what comes right before this, as Marina did a few minutes ago, you might hear this story in a very different way. Because what comes right before Jesus taking his seat in the treasury is a rather pointed teaching to the disciples, specifically focused on the religious leadership that they saw around them in the temple. Beware of the scribes, he taught them. Maybe as a group of scribes were just passing by over there. Beware of the scribes who like to walk around in long robes and to be greeted with respect in the marketplaces and to have the best seats in the synagogues and the places of honor at banquets. They devour widows' houses and for the sake of appearance say long prayers. They will receive the greater condemnation. If you are looking for clues as to why Jesus gets killed later this particular week of his life, this teaching isn't a bad place to start. Jesus had lots of strong words for the religious leadership of his day. They were more concerned about appearances than about true piety, about receiving honor than living justly, about being comfortable than caring for those who were really in need. And there's one part of that short speech he made there that we probably should pay particular attention to. These luxury-loving scribes devour widows' houses, Jesus says. He doesn't say exactly what he means by that statement, but it's clear that he sees the opulent living of the religious leaders as tied to the poverty of the widows that they should be concerned about. And it's kind of hard not to have that accusation ringing in your ears when just 2 verses later, Jesus and his disciples watch a widow make her way to the temple treasury to drop her last 2 coins in the box. Look at this injustice, goes this reading of the passage. Look at this mess of a system where people who are barely getting by are compelled to give even the little bit that they have to support a nice new robe for those who care nothing for them. By this reading, the woman is hardly a model of generosity. She's a person on the margins who has fallen prey to a corrupt, imbalanced system that is rigged in favor of those at the top. And that's a slightly less convenient message for Giving Sunday. So which reading is right? Is this story a positive one, with this example of generous, faithful giving right at the center? Or are we looking at a scene of moral chaos, with false piety running amok and the vulnerable getting trampled underneath? To be honest with you, I don't know exactly which reading is correct. I know that like the prophets before him, Jesus was deeply critical of systems that overlooked people who were poor and vulnerable. I know that his criticism of systems just like this got him into the kind of trouble that cost him his life. And I also know he had eyes that saw things that other people didn't. Eyes that saw goodness and grace and life where others saw nothing in particular. And so maybe that's the point of the story here. Instead of exactly which reading is right, maybe the point is to see this woman. She's the sort of person who might not be seen, after all. In the parade of ostentatious wealth that was crowding the room, she's the sort of person who might go unnoticed, a figure drawing no attention to herself and commanding no power or influence. And yet Jesus sees her. And maybe that's the point for us. To see both this messy, imperfect system in which she's operating at this moment, and also to see her as an individual person who acts with sincerity and trust and risk, and who is willing to be radically generous with even the little she has. There is something foul in the temple at this time. Jesus leaves no doubt about that. But I don't think he points to the widow only as a victim. I think he wants his disciples and us to see her and her quiet dignity. And when we see her, maybe that can remind us of the sort of eyes that God has. Eyes that overlook no one, that see each person, whether the world notices them or not. Eyes that notice the beauty and the value of each. Eyes that look with unconditional love. I don't think this passage really gives us a prescription for our Giving Sunday. It doesn't say how much money you should give in the coming year, or how much time you should commit to volunteering, or whether you should try singing in the choir or teaching Sunday school. What it does do, for me at least, is remind us of the sort of God that we're dealing with. One who is compassionate and inclusive and generous to give all that God has out of love for this world and its people. And that's the sort of spirit in which I want us, and I hope you, to give today. I want us to come forward with our offerings for the coming year, not because we're compelled or coerced or guilted into it, but because we're grateful. Because we are grateful for who our God is, and for all that we have been given, and for the strong love with which we and all God's people are seen. Amen.